All right, my friends, I apologize for the snow days that we had last Wednesday and Friday. Hope that you were totally safe, didn't hurt your cars, didn't have anybody that you knew who was inconvenienced or injured due to the snow days. And hopefully you really enjoyed sort of heavenly snowball-esque, snow globe-esque nature of Baton Rouge during those few days. They were pretty nice. Saw a lot of snowmen in my neighborhood. In any case, we now have to transition from the opening, the prelude of this course, considering the terms that comprise the title of the course: Modernism, Metempsychosis, and Masterpieces. And now we're going to move from the time of true modernism, definitional modernism, 1920s to 1930s, until about the 1940s when it started to peter out, way back into the early 17th century, far before what is generally considered the era of modernism. Back to Spain, southern Spain, and to near Toledo, and to a place called La Mancha, and the village of Toboso, where a certain Don Quixote is from. Titular character. Titular character is a character who gives his name or her name or their name to the title of the work. So the Odyssey, for example, is named for its titular character, Odysseus, and Don Quixote is named for Don Quixote, though we will talk a bit about Shakespearean maxim, what is in a name. Something to keep in mind, this early 17th century, 1605, when Don Quixote was first printed, is in fact the time of Shakespeare and the time that he was at the height of his powers. From 1601 to 1605 or so, Shakespeare wrote his four great tragedies: Hamlet, Macbeth, Othello, and King Lear. And in fact, Macbeth was his first play that was performed at night for King James, who himself wrote a work called On Demonology. He was a nighttime sort of guy. He was a spiritual occultist. And the play which is one of his shortest plays, so if you ever have a chance to just read a Shakespearean play, you will want to read it pretty quickly. Choose Macbeth, very short. But it was performed to candlelight. If you are sort of a sophisticated, cultured person, or wish to be perceived as such, at the very least, you should know that the Baton Rouge Symphony Orchestra sometimes does candlelight performances with segments of the entire symphony. You can't have all 50 of the symphonic members there to have an intimate time. You need like 3 or 4 quartets. In any case, we're going back to the early 17th century because I trace the beginnings of what we call modernism to this time, to this work in particular, this Don Quixote, because it does some strange things with form. It is not itself a linear text. It does not go from point A to point B. It is a story that has many stories within stories, with interludes within it. And there are even questions about the reliability of the narrator, who is himself not the person responsible for the creation of the story, but rather just the transmission of the story. So keep in mind that there is an author of the actual work. His name is Miguel de Cervantes. There is a narrator who is telling us what's going on, but then underlining the narrator is an Arab Muslim historian who writes in Arabic, sometimes called Moorish. Moorish is a term that was used in the Middle Ages. A Moor was an Arab Muslim at the time. It's a term that's gone out of fashion these days. But keep in mind that the actual author, Cervantes, writes and uses a narrator who himself has found a work that was originally written in Arabic, which had to be translated for him. So there's also a translator of this chronicle, so it's called. Chronicle is a historical work that claims to be true. And so even just looking at the authorship of this text, you notice that the author is being clever with form, is playing with us a little bit. How? Well, if there's a narrator, sometimes we have a convention in text in 20th century novels, for example, called the omniscient. narrator. And this narrator tells us how it is, regardless of whether we have access to the stream of consciousness or the internal dialogue of a character who may be deluding themselves. Often the narrator jumps in to let us know that this person may be lying to themselves, to others, or to us, but that this is what's happening. In this case, we have such a narrator, but the narrator's knowledge is based on a translated work of history. Two things about this. The narrator claims, or rather, the work of history itself claims that it is the true history of Don Quixote. And so this chronicle claims to be true. But one of the prejudicial perceptions of the narrator is that all Moors are liars. So this fictional story that has a fictional narrator has a narrator that has a prejudice against the truth value of things written and said by Moors, and yet the story he is telling is based on the translated work of Arabic from a Moor that claims to be true. So does even the narrator think that what he's telling you is true? It's sort of one of those questions that you might have to step on your left foot and step on your right, because you want to see, yeah, no. It's ambiguous. It's meant to be ambiguous. It is made to be like a needle in your mind, or like an itch that's just beyond your reach in your back, something that draws your focus to it and remains on your mind, and yet you cannot put an end to it. And so this is part of, remember the four aspects of modernism that we discussed with B. One of them is form, and playing with form. And so this is not a biblical text. This is not a piece of philosophy. This is not a history. It is a work of fiction that claims to be derived within the fiction itself from a true work. And so what is it exactly is one of the questions that we are going to ask about this. What is this genre? And I encourage you, put away the word novel. We will be reading a few novels, 3 novels in this class. And there are arguments that you can make to say that this is a novel, but really this 17th century work of fiction, I will call it a text or work of fiction, comes before the generic conventions of novels had been created really in the 18th century in France. A novel itself comes from the French word like nouveau or nouvelle, depending on which gender, which means, anybody got good French? Is that art nouveau? New, right. So the novel is the new, like the news, by the way. And the interesting thing you might want to wonder about is, what is the relationship between the novel and the news? James Joyce will consider that. Let's say the news isn't worthwhile, the novels are. In any case, keep this initial annoying ambiguity in your mind, because if you have been keeping up in the reading, you have met Cid Hamete Benengeli. You have seen also that the story actually cuts off at one point, because the first volume of the Chronicle from Cid Hamete Benengeli is finished, and our narrator does not have access to the remainder of the story. He has to then walk through a bazaar marketplace at some point, hear a man laughing while reading Arabic, ask about what he's reading, hear that it is about Don Quixote, and then enlist the help of a translator to then translate that work into Spanish for him so that he can relate it to us. All right, but let's jump outside of the text for a moment and talk about some relevant publication information. This is a work by Miguel de Cervantes. It was first written, part 1. This is a work split into part 1 and part 2 in 1605. The second part, which was not intended from the beginning, was written in 1615. I'll talk a lot about why he wrote the second part, but there are at least 2 reasons. One is that the first part, though it was a success, was not a smash success. Did not shoot Cervantes into huge literary fame in the way that he had envisioned. This is the golden age of Spanish literature at this time, and there was a very famous Spanish poet. His name is falling out of my head, but I'll remember it later because I've said it so many times. Who wrote himself around 1,000 plays. 1,000 plays. Shakespeare has, I think, 39 plays, and a couple ones that we know that we lost And so, wow, time of great productivity in the early 17th century in Spain. Miguel de Cervantes himself was born 29 September 1547 in Alcalá de Henares, Spain. And interestingly, he died on April 23rd, 1615. I want to say. Oh, yeah, that's interesting. 23 April 1650. Yeah. And you may, do any of you know what's special about April 23rd as a date? It's also the date on which Shakespeare died. And so Shakespeare and Cervantes died on the exact same date. Why do I say date? Because Spain and Britain at the time were actually on different calendars. So they may have died on a different day. The work itself was published in 1605, like I said, which is completely contemporaneous with Shakespeare's late work, Macbeth, also published or was performed in 1605. We can tell you a little bit about how plays were published at that time. They weren't really published. They were given in parts to actors, but we'll talk about that later. The second part was published in 1615 in response to Fernández Avellaneda's second book of the ingenious knight Don Quixote. Avellaneda, you'll hear this name over and over again, wrote a spurious second part of Don Quixote. That is itself a pseudonym. A pseudonym is a false name or a pen name, as we sometimes call it. It comes from pseudo, false, nem, onomos, and Greek, which means, or onoma, excuse me, which means name, false name. Sometimes we call this a nom de plume in French. With that. If any of you are really stud athletes and really dominate whatever you do, maybe you have a nom de guerre. Anybody know what a guerre is? Know any guerreros? Yes, guerreros in Spanish. Nom de guerre is a warning, name of war, name that you earn through your valor. So Scipio Africanus of the Roman Republic was given the name Africanus because of his victories against the Carthaginians, northern Africa at the time. And so Cervantes himself died the same day as Shakespeare, April 23rd, 1615, though not the same day. And that's just a little bit about him. I guess I'll say a couple things about him to make him sound, to just help you to know that this was not simply a writer. Cervantes, like Aeschylus, perhaps you know Aeschylus, one of the three great tragedians, the oldest of the three great tragedians from Athenian democracy. Aeschylus, Sophocles, who you most undoubtedly were assigned to read in high school, Oedipus, Tyrannus, Antigone, Oedipus at Colonus, and Euripides. Probably you've never read much Euripides, though he has the most excellent work that still exists, that we still have access to. Aeschylus himself, though a major playwright, a major tragedian, wrote something like 90 plays during the time. I think had something like 30 victories at the Athenian festivals that competes the tragedians against two other playwrights at the time who had to be nominated and paid for, and they would compete in trilogies with a satyr play, sort of a comedy. Get all the tragedy out of your minds before you go along your merry ways at the end of their trilogies. In any case, Aeschylus, at his burial site, supposedly there was something written like an epitaph. And on the epitaph, even though he had been such a great playwright, such a notorious playwright, he had written that here lies someone who stood against the Persians, a little bit of a paraphrase on me, because of his stand with the Athenians against the Persians in 490 BCE. And so even though he was a literary man to some extent, he identified most as a warrior. Cervantes, who will become much more philosophical and developed as a writer in the second part of Don Quixote. I think you'll notice that a lot of what makes this puzzling and enigmatic book great comes in the second part. A lot of what makes it interesting and potentially great comes from the first part. He will consider the relationship between the so-called man of letters, like me, man of the sword, sort of based on the medieval idea of the three estates, that there are those who work, there are those who fight, and there are those who are the priestly caste, who are the people of letters, traditionally speaking, and even still to some extent. Cervantes himself was a warrior who fought against Northern Africans in various battles, the Battle of Lepanto. And in fact, loses a piece of his hand from a cannonball and is insulted by a bayoneta for being one-handed. We'll bring this up at the beginning of part 2, and is taken into slavery for several years until his family can put together the money to ransom him. And then he returns home. So he is himself a man of action and a person who identifies as a warrior, not simply a writer of words. And so you should know that this is a pretty interesting person who had a very full and rich life. And if you have been reading alongside so far, I think you notice that his wry humor is the sort of humor that generally comes from somebody that has had quite a bit of experiences, sometimes quite a bit of negative experiences in one's life, and yet takes them with good humor, as it were. In any case, Don Quixote is split into 2 parts, both published at different times, 1605 for part 1, 1615 for the second part, 10 years after. The first part is itself split into 4 subparts. The second part engages with characters who have, this is a very interesting point. Part of the dynamic playing with form that Cervantes gets into in this text is that in part 2, one meets characters from the spurious part 2 that Avellaneda read, but one also finds characters who have read part 1. So think about this. There's this Don Quixote character. Basically, everybody that meets him thinks he's crazy, and they play jokes on him often. In the second part, there will be characters who have read the first part and seen the craziness, the insanity of Don Quixote. This word is used over and over and over and over again. It's not my personal judgment on his sanity. This is the judgment of all the characters that meet him on his sanity. But there will be characters, in particular, the Duke and the Duchess, who will have a large role to play in the second part, who have read the first part, have been amused by the characters of Sancho, the sidekick of Don Quixote, and Don Quixote, and will play additional tricks on them, knowing that they are one is an insane false knight errant. There are no such things as knight errants at the time of Don Quixote, and perhaps in the ways that he envisions what a knight errant is, that perhaps there were never any at all that were perfectly chivalrous. In fact, his ideas don't just come, mostly do not come from histories of knights, but rather chivalric romantic tales of knights, which are themselves fictions. So part of how Don Quixote constructs his identity is on clear fictions that he has read. And so characters in the second part will exploit this for their own amusement. It would be like if you met Don Quixote after having read part 1 and thought, I'm pretty bored right now. I bet I can have some fun with this individual. And you'd probably be correct, depending on when you met this particular Don Quixote and if you could speak Spanish. All right. What's in a name? Again, another sort of modernist convention here is to pull the rug out from under us, or to keep the ground on which we are walking unstable, so that we cannot quite trust our footing, so that our understandings and interpretations of this text are not quite fully grounded, as it were. And so what do I mean by this? You see this in the very first paragraph of the book. Maybe I'll even open it and read it to you, because, well, who can do it better than the master himself? First part of the ingenious gentleman, ingenioso is what it says in Spanish, Don Quixote de la Mancha. It's funny, prologue. I should read the prologue. One thing I will say, desocupado lector, idle reader. He calls you idle reader. Idle reader, without my swearing to it, you can believe that I would like this book, The Child of My Understanding, to be the most beautiful, the most brilliant, the most discreet that anyone could imagine. This is Cervantes himself speaking to you. But after the prologue falls away, we will. There are some poems. The poems are themselves very interesting. In fact, you have 2 horses at some point give poems back to each other. Alexander the Great's Bucephalus, and then Don Quixote's old nag, Rocinante, will write sonnets to each other, which is a convention of 16th, 17th century romantic fiction, that they would have quotes from great masters, like from the Roman tradition, Cicero, Horace the satirist, or from the Greek tradition, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Plato, Aristotle, maybe Herodotus, probably not. Father of history, father of lies, some say. In any case, idle reader suggests the people who are reading fiction at this time are not reading to be informed, like readers of history. They're not reading with a religious intent, as people prior to the 15th century and the invention of the printing press, 1453, would have done. And so now there is a class of individuals who, for their own leisure, for their own entertainment, does what? Or do what? Does what? Read. I know. It's a thing that people like me often bemoan that people like you don't do enough these days. But this activity itself is a fairly modern activity and has never been as widely spread an activity as some who do not have education into the past may believe. Literacy has never been extremely high. And even those who become literate, you should really look at the data for how many books most people have ever read who even have college educations, and how many books people read after they leave college. I'll tell you what, there are a lot of people who never read 5 more books for the remainder of their life. And I say that with, a little bit of derision, but mostly as an adult, I'll say you get very busy. This is your time to read. When you have so many hours to yourself, I mean, it probably seems like you don't have that much time because you have so much going on. That said, once you have a job, perhaps a long-term relationship and some children and a dog, time just trickles away. So that said, in any case, this book is written for this new class of individual who has the time and the means to sit around and read. And this would be pretty good education. There are plays that exist at this time. Operas are coming around pretty soon after this, but there is no TV. There's no digital music. There are no computers. There's no internet. And so, if one is going to be entertained in a sort of sedentary, relaxed way, there are only so many forms of doing it. Or there were almost so many forms at this particular time. In any case, let me read what it was that I said I was going to read that tells us about names. Moving on from the prologue to the first part, chapter 1, let's hear what the narrator has to say to us and see how reliable we think he is. Somewhere in La Mancha, immediate. Is he definite or indefinite? Somewhere. Indefinite. Somewhere in La Mancha, it's vague. In a place whose name I do not care to remember. Doesn't even care to remember the name. This is a very new way of writing. What does he mean he doesn't care to remember? We're reading him so that we can get what it is he knows, not what he does not know, this narrator. A gentleman lived not long ago. Again, how definite is not long ago? It's like a time. What is the convention we use with our fairy tales? A blank, 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 and a blank, blank, blank. You can tell us, watched their Shrek recently or read a fairy tale. A long time ago in a place far, far away. Where is that? And when is that? What's a long time ago? For you, 3 years, right? That's not that long for me. For me, 7 years. That's not that long for people much older than I am. In any case. One of those who has a lance and ancient shield on a shelf and keeps a skinny nag and a greyhound for racing. An occasional stew, beef more often than lamb, hash most nights, eggs and abstinence on Saturdays. This means this guy's a petty lord. He is something like, these conventions do not really, it's hard to transpose them from one time and place, 21st century bourgeois middle class culture onto 17th century, post-feudal times. But this guy is like an upper middle class lord. He is not a lordly lord who has many, many servants. He has a single maid and a niece that serve him. He owns a home, and he has a library within this home. He has land as well, and land that he has sold in order to get more books. So he's a landed gentleman to some extent, but he is not so gentlemanly that he has the right to have noble rank. Though he will arrogate a noble rank to himself. What is an indicator in the name of a noble that allows one to know that in fact they are noble? maybe you've seen this in French, maybe you've seen this in Spanish, maybe you've seen this in Dutch, maybe you've seen this in German. To be called Don Quixote de la Mancha. I don't know if you've ever seen The Godfather. This convention is fairly similar. But to be a Don, this comes from the Latin word dominus, which is what a lord of a manor would be called. To be Don Quixote is to be a true noble. The character who takes on the name of Don Quixote is not himself named Don Quixote. He, in an identity-altering, transformative way, takes on this name and also arrogates a rank to himself. You might say, well, I understand that we're in a time of definition and redefinition, but even today, in order to change one's name, one has to go through sort of a legal procedure. How did one become a noble in 17th century Spain? Well, I'll say it would take the act of a king. And so can he make himself noble? No. But can he take on the name of a noble? Yes. Will this add to the belief in the characters who meet Don Quixote that he is insane? Probably. If you walked around asking people to call you professor or king or mayor or duke, probably they think you're a little weird. Maybe they'd even say no. And so also notice here, de la Mancha. Anybody know what de means in Spanish, French? Of La Mancha. It's like von in German or van in Dutch. To be of the land means to be the possessor of the land. And so it is as if he is the dominus, the lord of La Mancha, when in fact he is just a sort of middle-class gentleman who lives within La Mancha. So not only is he altering his identity in order to take on a fictional identity that itself is generated in his mind from the fictional works that he has read, he is also attempting to alter his rank within the world as well. So his act of definition and redefinition is more extraordinary than simply changing his name from one name to another, going from George Jorge to Fred. Be like going from George to Lord Fred. In any case, a little bit more. And the stew, the fact that he has beef more than lamb, this convention that still exists. Which is the more expensive meat? Lamb, exactly. And even beef itself, what is the most expensive cut of beef? Wagyu. That's pretty good. Here are some other ones though. You might think of a cut. A lot of people think of, they're like, well, beef, steak, or like a tomahawk steak. A Chateaubriand is what you really want. If you're trying to be, if you're going to your candlelight, BRSO, quartet, you might want to have a Chateaubriand before. But yes, right, we still have these indications of class and culture and status, right? You eat a beef taco that says some, as opposed to a piece of veal, this is, you would expect to receive these differing foods in differing places that say differing things about themselves. And so this is an indication to us that this is not a person who is royal in any way. Hash, most nights, eggs and abstinence on Saturdays due to religious fasting. Lentils on Fridays also due to religious fasting. Or any of you Catholics, any of you do eat fast on Fridays, know about these sorts of things, have a lot of fish. Yeah. I went to school at a Catholic school in Milwaukee. Fish Fridays always smell terrible. I hate the smell of fish. Like fish, I hate the smell. Sometimes squab is a treat on Sundays. He's consumed 3/4 of his income. The rest, okay. He had a housekeeper passport. Okay. Here's one other thing about this man. Our gentleman was approximately 50 years old. His complexion was weathered, his flesh scrawny, his face gaunt, and he was a very early riser and a great lover of the hunt. Okay, so this is something else you need to know. Think about most stories you've ever read. Protagonists, they tend to be young or old. Think about almost every story you've ever witnessed, seen, even video games that you play. The preponderance of protagonists tend to be what age or so? Yes.
Younger.
Younger. Maybe even between what ages? 14 to 18, maybe 14 to 25, something like that. This is actually kind of a sad thing about growing up. Once you all get to 30, almost every story stops being just about you, which is really sad. As somebody who's absorbed thousands and thousands of stories, I can tell you that's true. But right, this is a strange protagonist. Not only do we not know where he lives, when necessarily he lives, we do know that he's changed his name, but he's also an old man trying to redefine himself, change his name, and then change the world. This doesn't quite fit, right? The idea tends to be that who is going to change the world? Who has the energy and the vigor and the vision to change the world for the better? Those who are nouveau and nouvelle, the new, the young, the new humans, right? And yet, this is an old man. And you don't need to tell me this, but check your own personal prejudices. When you hear that he is old, does this make you a little bit more interested in him? Or a little bit less interested in him? And you might say, well, it's not necessarily prejudice. It's because he's not the same as we are. And, we like reading about people who are similar to us. And I think, is that not a prejudice to prefer to be near someone who is similar to you as opposed to someone who is not? And what makes you think that he is not similar to you? Only his age? I suppose you don't share that in common. That's it. This is a strange protagonist. More strangeness, oddity about him. Let's see some more indefinite stuff. Some claim, this is bad writing, by the way. Don't write essays like sometime at some place and some guy. Terrible, but clever fiction writing. Some claim that his family name was Quijada or Quejada, where there's a certain amount of disagreement among the authors who write of this matter. Although reliable conjecture seems to indicate that his name was Quejana. But this does not matter very much to our story and its telling. There is absolutely no But this does not matter very much to our story. In its telling, there is absolutely no deviation from the truth. But what was the truth that was just expressed to you? Well, it's hard to say, right? It's like that he had some name, which is not Don Quixote, but it might have been Quijada, might have been Quejada. Names matter, right? It matters if your name is Schmid, like mine, as opposed to Schmidt. Many people get wrong. For example, I'll tell you, this is huge. Schmidt. Which language does this come from? And which people? German. The Germans. It is a German name. It is a high German name. It's a linguistic thing. It's like coming from Massachusetts. My name is a Swiss Low German variant. It's like having a Southern or a country name. There's a connotation to it. The German hears this, not royalty. And yet, my people came over here around World War I's time, meaning that my name indicates that there is not an ambiguity in my relationship to my past. So when people call me Schmidt, they are arrogating to me Germany's history. That is inappropriate to who I am as a Swiss person. That said, I don't much care for that. Everybody gets it wrong. Of course, names, as important as they are, very difficult to understand and how they've been changed. Most of our names here in America, not most of them, many people's names here in America as a nation of immigrants have been changed for one reason or another. Either they came over by force and they took names of people, often people that brought them by force, or they came through Ellis Island and they changed their names and they wanted to Americanize them to some extent. You see this in various cultures. You see this in Italian culture, Chinese culture, Irish culture. Many people that come from these particular backgrounds have names that they have altered in order to fit in America. My people did not do this. They wanted to remain Swiss, and yet Americans will all often very politely add the T to my last name so that I become the standard German. That said, Quijada or Quejada matters whether that is his name or not. And then you add to this the fact that, well, actually, his name may be Quejana, but it doesn't really matter. Do we trust that? Does it not matter? It doesn't matter to the story, but to us as readers, don't we want to know when this is said? Don't we want to know where it's said? Don't we want to know the identity of this individual? This is creating in us a longing for definiteness, for some hook on which to connect our projections, and yet we are being denied this by this masterful writer. In any case, we will later find out in the second part that none of these names are actually the name of Don Quixote. He will break his sanity at some point. Please do excuse me for being a professor and not just a critic. I will spoil things at times, but these are great texts whose stories are sort of well known. And so even though you may not know it, and I might spoil some things, so I'm very sorry. And so do tell me if I do that and that was tragic to you and you hated it so that I don't do it as much in the future. But Don Quixote will break his insanity near the end of the book. It's actually quite tragic. We will have come to love him to some extent. I make this claim. Insofar as you read this text, you will probably really, really like Don Quixote. You might like Sancho a lot more. Most people tend to. But it'll be sad. But we'll find out at the end that his name is actually Alonso Quejada the Good. Not good. Remember where the good comes from. That's obviously something added to his name. A non-aware. This was a good man before. And saying, doesn't that make you feel? Doesn't that twist the knife just a little bit more about him? In any case, we are in an indefinite place of a name we're not quite sure of, somewhere near La Mancha, with a character whose name that we can't quite pin down, who is himself going to get rid of this name and give himself a new name, Don Quixote. This will happen over and over and over in the text. So we talked about modernism, the issue of perspective and subjectivity. And the idea of seeing things from two different perspectives. And I showed you the Picasso, the image of a woman in profile and also searching for it. With a philosophical underlying it that there might be some way of seeing things from two perspectives at once, and this might give you something closer or approximating the truth of a notion. Don Quixote, part of his powers as an insane person will be that he redefines the nature of the objects around him. What do I mean? Well, he'll take a shaving basin, a basin in which you have shaving cream. We don't use these anymore, unless you go to a proper barber. And he will call it the helm of Mambrino. He will turn it into a magical helm. He will turn it into a magical helm, which means he will call it a magical helm and then use it. You know, if you're more of a functionalist than a formalist, do you understand the distinction between these terms? Formalists believe that things, the end of a thing or the purpose of a thing is defined by its form. Functionalists believe that the end or the purpose of a thing is defined by what it is supposed to do. So I've said this before, but think about the number of chairs you see. Some of them are on swivels, some of them are on 4 legs, some of them are on 3 legs, some of them are on no legs at all. And, or, you know, it's a beanie baby, or beanie baby, it's a beanbag chair. You get into these definitional issues, just sort of like as a hot dog sandwich. Maybe you've had to deal with that before as a taco sandwich. What about a quesadilla? Right? A lot of the same things, a lot of the same function, except yet form pretty similar, but a little bit different, hard to say. In any case, Don Quixote will claim when he sees things differently from those around him, that magical enchanters have enchanted his eyes to see differently from others because they are his enemies. That is a power that they have. He knows that they have this power from the fictional works that he has read. And so he will justify his differing perceptions of reality based on the fact that only he could see what he saw, because only he is being attacked by these particular enemy enchanters. And this will happen over and over again. The most famous instance early on in chapter 7 or chapter 8 of part 1 is the episode of the windmills. Very famously, if you know one thing about Don Quixote, you probably know about his great battle with the windmills, which happens extremely early on in this very, very long story, which tells you about how far many people get into these great works. But he will see what Sancho and all others consider windmills, including the narrator. He will think they are giants. He will charge towards them with his lance, and he will suffer a catastrophic defeat where one of the wings of the windmill or the fans of the windmill pick him up off of Rocinante, drop him to the ground in full armor, which I don't know if you've ever been falling on your butt from like 5-10 feet up. It hurts. And this will be something that happens to him frequently. When Don Quixote perceives reality differently from those around him, he often suffers physical consequences. He supports Rocinante and also Sancho, who is his peasant neighbor who is following him around in order to be granted an insula, which is a small island. Sancho will eventually get the insula, by the way, and will be enriched by his friendship, his relationship with Don Quixote, though it will not seem as if that would be the case for, I think, the entirety of the first part. Something else about Don Quixote and this taking on of a fictional identity. Have any of you ever seen Star Wars or say Lord of the Rings? What is something that Jedi do not seem to carry around that most people in the city would carry around and consider necessary in order to interact in the city? Something that you probably have on you, though not as much as you would like. Yes?
Money.
Money, right. Money, maybe some sort of identification not as important at this time. When Don Quixote sallies out, he is a minor nobleman. He has land. He has money. He has money to buy books. Books are expensive. Media continues to be expensive, right? Though it's not books necessarily impress people now. It's like a big TV or something like that. Something to entertain people, to show them. And so Don Quixote, when he first sallies out, he wants to stay in a hotel. He defines it as a castle. Castles invite you in, don't take money from you. So he thinks that when he stays in this hotel that he defines as a castle, he will not have to pay money. This will be a major mistake of his because the hotelier, the one who owns the hotel, will grant a service to him and expect payment. And this will be the sort of clash that Don Quixote runs into over and over again with the people around. I mean, imagine if you tried to pull this sort of thing. It's like, you know, you went to the office of the bursar here and you said, I'm not staying in a dorm, I'm staying in a noble castle that I was invited to by the Duke of Baton Rouge. Where to even start with a claim like that? It's like the Duke of that, we have mayor, not Duke, and the castle, we don't have any castles here, as we have a dormitory. Strange, and it costs money to have lodging, and yet, so you can understand that you would be dealing with a very tricky issue, and particularly if you were the administrator dealing with a student who held those sorts of views, you might think, I don't know if I'm quite trained to deal with all of this. I might need a psychotherapist here in order to help me with this interaction. But this is the sort of person that Don Quixote is. And this is part of the reason it is very difficult to interact with him, because how do you interact with someone who is crazy, who does not observe and evaluate the circumstances of society in a way similar to your own? You might yourselves have many different values from those around you, but a lot of them are common, right? Which side of the road do you drive on? Which language are you going to speak and write in class? When somebody is walking towards you, you just run into them here in the States? No, probably not. Regardless of all you're doing, how long is your hair? Right? Any of you have hair down to here? So I can tell you here, Baton Rouge, my length of hair, given the gender identified to me by people who see me, and the one that I take for myself, and the one which I was assigned at birth, was it's strange. I was once getting my hair cut, believe it or not, and a local lady came up to me and said, "Who are you that you have such long hair?" And I said, "Well, I actually teach at LSU, so that'll do it." You know, because length of hair is tied to the conventions of a society and also one's rank within society. To have long hair in this conventional society tends to be either mean that you have lack of rank, like a homeless person, an unhoused person, or that you have high rank, like a rock star or an athlete or a professor. Me, I'm just a funny person. In any case, meeting somebody like Don Quixote who doesn't evaluate the reality of things around you in the same way and has very differing perceptions of how to act in situations that everybody else seems to understand how to act. You're all being fairly silent right now. Don Quixote wouldn't necessarily understand this situation. He might see me as, in his words, a Moorish spy and attack me. And this would be quite the moment for all of you, right? It'd be like, you know, you'd be like, that's kind of violent. I feel sorry for Professor Ned, but It's also pretty funny, and I'm definitely telling everybody about it. This is where the people who are watching the interactions between him and whomever he is interacting with, this is how they feel. And so it's like a constant spectacle with him because it's like, what is he going to do next? What is he going to do next? And the things he does at first seem very small, and it almost seems as if nothing interesting will ever happen in this book. But just wait, just wait. All right, cool. One last thing about his name I should have mentioned. Not only does he add a Don inappropriately, he is not of the rank necessary to give himself a Don. My own rank. Once I am Dr. Schmidt, that is not a rank that I can earn that rank by doing the necessary, by writing the dissertation and defending it. But I cannot myself confer this rank onto myself. So we know that he has inappropriately called himself Don and de la Mancha. Quixote subverts the idea of nobility. What do I mean by subverts? What is subversion? What does it mean to turn under? That's the literal meaning of subversion. Similar but different from conversion or perversion. To subvert something is to undermine it. And so if he is attempting to appear as a noble with Don and de la Mancha, a pejorative suffix like ote undermines this. Do any of you know what a pejorative is? So this comes from Spanish, peor, worse. A pejorative is a term of disparagement. Not necessarily like to call someone a swear word, but to belittle or diminish somebody to some extent. And so ote is like saying, that little lord. Is that a respectful way of addressing a lord? No, it's a sort of diminishing, companionate way of saying, my little friend, or something. Ote has a negative connotation, as if anybody who has ote at the end of their name is less than they otherwise would be. And so it's a very strange name for him to choose. It would be like me calling myself, if I wanted to seem royal, but I subverted myself unconsciously, like King Picklebrat. Sure, I'm calling myself king, but then I'm making fun of myself seeming. And so what image of myself am I conveying to you exactly? Is it a consistent one? If I call myself like King Lion, you know who I want to be. But if I call myself like, say, King Lamb, all of a sudden we're getting into some Christian, interesting, contradictory behavior here. What's the King Lamb? A creature that is preyed upon by every other creature around it. That's strange. And so know that when we ask the question, what's in a name, with Don Quixote, there's actually quite a lot. And so that's where we'll end for this day. I hope that we have the projector back to us. I do like the projector quite a bit. And I do hope that we are prepared for all things coming on Wednesday.